Hey guys, tonight we begin with something wonderfully mundane, yet surprisingly intricate. The daily ritual of medieval bakers who rose before the roosters, before the church bells, before even the most devout monks stirred for morning prayers. These flour-dusted artisans operated in a world where bread wasn't just food. It was survival, currency, and social order all rolled into one chewy, sometimes gritty loaf. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. It's 3 in the morning in a medieval town, maybe York or Canterbury or some nameless village tucked between a manor house and a muddy road. The air is thick with mist and the lingering smell of yesterday's cooking fires. Most people are deep in their second sleep, that curious medieval practice where folks would wake up for an hour or two in the middle of the night before drifting off again until dawn. But in the narrow streets near the market square, a few small windows begin to glow with the warm flicker of candlelight. These are the bakeries, and inside them, a very particular kind of person is already hard at work. The medieval baker wasn't just getting up early. He was getting up absurdly early, often around 2 or 3 in the morning, sometimes even earlier during feast days or market days, when demand would be particularly high. This wasn't because he was especially ambitious, or because he loved the quiet hours before dawn. It was because bread, real bread, the kind that fed entire communities, required an enormous amount of time to prepare properly. And in a world without electric mixers, gas ovens, or even reliable clocks, everything had to be done by hand, by feel, and by the ancient rhythm of fermentation that couldn't be rushed, no matter how much the guild masters demanded it. Our baker would stumble from his bed, which was likely just a straw mattress in a room above or behind his workshop. The air would be cold, sometimes brutally cold, and his first task wasn't to stretch or grab a quick bite to eat. It was to coax his ovens back to life. Medieval ovens were massive stone or brick constructions, often built into the walls of the bakery itself. They retained heat well once they got going, but they took forever to warm up properly, and even longer to reach the consistent, even temperature needed for good bread. The process began with building a fire directly inside the oven. Not beside it, not underneath it, but right inside the baking chamber itself. The baker would stack dry wood, kindling, and sometimes charcoal in the center of the oven floor and light it, creating a roaring fire that would heat the stone walls and floor for hours. This wasn't a quick process. The oven needed to be heated until the stones glowed white hot, which could take anywhere from 2 to 4 hours, depending on the size of the oven and the outside temperature. Only then could the real work begin. While the fire burned and the stones slowly absorbed heat, our baker would turn his attention to the dough that had been quietly working overnight. Medieval bread making was largely a process of patience and timing. The night before, he would have prepared what was called the sponge, a mixture of flour, water, and a piece of sourdough starter saved from the previous day's batch. This mixture would sit overnight in wooden troughs, slowly fermenting and developing the complex flavors and textures that made medieval bread so different from anything we might recognize today. The starter itself was precious, almost sacred. It was a living thing, a colony of wild yeasts and bacteria that had to be carefully maintained day after day, month after month, sometimes for years. Losing your starter was a catastrophe that could put a baker out of business. Some bakers would actually lend portions of their starter to competitors who had lost theirs, not out of pure generosity, but because a town without enough bread was a town in crisis, and crisis was bad for everyone's business. By the time the oven was properly heated, usually around 5 or 6 in the morning, the sponge would have doubled in size, filled with air bubbles and carrying the tangy, yeasty smell that meant the fermentation was working properly. Now came the most physically demanding part of the process. The baker would add more flour, salt, and sometimes honey or ale to the sponge, creating a massive amount of dough that needed to be kneaded by hand. And when I say massive, I mean it. A typical medieval baker might be working with enough dough to make 50, 100, or even more loaves at once. Kneading this much dough was exhausting work. The baker would lean his entire body weight into the wooden trough, pushing and folding the dough again and again until his arms ached and sweat ran down his face despite the cool morning air. There were no mechanical aids, no helpful apprentices in many cases, just one person working alone in the flickering candlelight, wrestling with what amounted to a small mountain of increasingly sticky, elastic dough. The kneading had to be perfect. Too little, and the bread would be dense and heavy, the kind of loaf that could break teeth and sat like a stone in the stomach. Too much, and the dough would become tough and chewy, equally unappetizing but in a different way. The baker had to judge the texture by feel alone, knowing exactly when the dough had reached that perfect balance of elasticity and smoothness that would produce a good rise and a tender crumb. Once the dough was properly kneaded, it needed to rise again. This second rise was crucial, and it required yet more patience and careful timing. The shaped loaves would be placed on wooden boards or directly on floured cloths, then left to slowly expand as the yeast continued its work. Too warm, and they would rise too quickly, creating a coarse, uneven texture. Too cold, and they might not rise at all, producing dense, flat loaves that no one would want to buy. During this rising time, the baker would finally turn his attention to the oven itself. By now, the fire had burned down to coals and ash, and the stone walls and floor were radiating intense heat. The next step was to rake out all the coals and ash, sweeping the oven floor completely clean with long-handled brushes made of bundled twigs or straw. This was delicate work. Any remaining ash or charcoal would burn and stick to the bottom of the loaves, creating bitter, inedible spots that customers would complain about loudly and at length. The temperature of the oven was judged not by thermometers, which didn't exist, but by experience and a few traditional tests. Some bakers would throw a handful of flour onto the oven floor and watch how quickly it browned. Others would hold their hand near the opening and count how long they could stand the heat. The most experienced bakers could simply look at the color of the stone walls and know whether the temperature was right for bread, or whether it was still too hot and needed to cool down a bit more. Getting the temperature wrong was a disaster. Too hot, and the outside of the loaves would burn while the inside remained raw and doughy. Too cool, and the bread would bake unevenly, never developing the proper crust or internal structure that marked quality work. There was no way to adjust the temperature once the bread went in. You got one chance, and you had to get it right. When the oven temperature was finally judged perfect, the baker faced what was perhaps the most nerve-wracking moment of his entire day: loading the bread. This wasn't simply a matter of sliding loaves onto shelves. Medieval ovens were deep, cavernous spaces, and getting dozens of loaves positioned correctly required tools, technique, and nerves of steel. The primary tool was a long wooden paddle called a peel, sometimes 8 or 10 feet long, designed to slide loaves deep into the oven without the baker having to get too close to the scorching heat. But using a peel effectively was an art form. The wooden surface had to be dusted with just the right amount of flour or cornmeal to prevent sticking, but not so much that it created a slippery mess. The loaves had to be positioned on the peel at precisely the right angle, then slid off with a quick, confident motion that left them exactly where they needed to be inside the oven. A clumsy baker could lose an entire day's work in seconds. Loaves that stuck to the peel would tear apart when he tried to remove them. Loaves that slid off at the wrong angle might crash into each other, deflating hours of careful rising. Worst of all, a loaf that fell off the peel entirely would hit the hot oven floor and be ruined instantly, filling the bakery with the smell of burning bread and the baker's muttered curses. The loading process had to be fast. Every second the oven door remained open, precious heat escaped into the cool morning air. A skilled baker could load 30 or 40 loaves in just a few minutes, working with smooth, practiced motions that looked almost like a dance. Slide the peel in, angle it just right. Give it a sharp jerk to release the loaf. Withdraw the peel, grab the next loaf, repeat. Over and over until every available space in the oven was filled. But the work didn't end once the bread was loaded. Medieval ovens were sealed shut during baking, trapping the heat and steam inside to create the proper baking environment. This meant the baker couldn't check on his loaves, couldn't rotate them if they were browning unevenly, couldn't make adjustments if something was going wrong. He simply had to wait, listening to the subtle sounds of baking bread and hoping his timing had been perfect. The waiting period gave him time to clean up the chaos of the morning's work. Flour covered every surface, including the baker himself. The kneading troughs needed to be scraped clean and prepared for the next day's batch. Tools had to be washed and put away. The work area had to be swept, because flour on the floor was flour wasted, and waste was something no medieval baker could afford. During this cleaning time, the baker would also prepare for the rest of his day. Medieval bakers didn't just make bread. They often served as the neighborhood's oven for hire, allowing housewives to bring their own prepared dishes to be cooked in the residual heat after the bread came out. Pies, roasts, casseroles, anything that needed slow, even cooking could benefit from the baker's oven, and this service provided crucial additional income. The smell of baking bread would begin to fill the bakery around dawn, that rich, yeasty aroma that could make mouths water from blocks away. This was both advertising and torture for the baker himself, who had been working for hours and probably hadn't eaten anything since his meager dinner the night before. But he couldn't sample his wares, not yet. Every loaf represented potential income, and even a small bite could mean the difference between a loaf that sold and one that didn't. Judging when the bread was done required the same intuitive skills that had guided the entire process. The baker would listen for the hollow sound that properly baked loaves made when tapped with a knuckle. He would look for the deep golden brown color that indicated a good crust. Most importantly, he would smell for that moment when the aroma shifted from raw dough to finished bread, a change so subtle that only experience could detect it. Removing the finished loaves was almost as tricky as loading them had been. The oven was still blazingly hot, and the bread had to come out quickly before it overcooked. The same long peels that had loaded the loaves now had to extract them, but the loaves were now hot, fragile, and much more likely to break apart if handled roughly. A torn loaf was a damaged loaf, and damaged loaves sold for less money, or sometimes couldn't be sold at all. As each loaf emerged from the oven, it would be set on wooden racks to cool. This cooling process was crucial, but often overlooked in modern understanding of medieval baking. Bread that was too hot couldn't be cut properly. The crumb would be gummy and unpleasant, and the crust would lose its appealing crispness. But bread that cooled too slowly might develop condensation that would make the crust soggy. The baker had to balance speed with care, getting the loaves out of the oven quickly, but then arranging them so air could circulate around each one. The cooling racks themselves were works of craftsmanship, wooden frameworks that allowed maximum airflow while supporting the weight of dozens of heavy loaves. By mid-morning, usually around 8 or 9 o'clock, the first customers would begin to appear. These weren't necessarily people buying bread for immediate consumption. Medieval bread was often purchased in large quantities, enough to last a family several days, or even a week. Customers would examine each loaf carefully, looking for the telltale signs of quality, proper color, good shape, the right heft that indicated proper baking. The baker's reputation lived or died by these morning sales. Word traveled fast in medieval communities, and a baker who consistently produced poor bread would soon find himself without customers. Conversely, a baker known for quality could command premium prices and build a loyal following that would sustain his business through lean times. But quality wasn't the only concern. Medieval baking was heavily regulated by local guilds and municipal authorities. Loaves had to meet specific weight requirements, often verified by official inspectors who would arrive unannounced with certified scales. Bread that was underweight could result in fines, public shaming, or even temporary closure of the bakery. The regulations weren't arbitrary. In a world where bread was often the primary source of calories for working people, cheating on weight or quality was seen as a form of theft from the poor. Bakers who were caught shortchanging their customers faced not just legal penalties but social ostracism that could destroy their livelihoods permanently. The social position of a medieval baker was peculiar and contradictory. On one hand, they provided something absolutely essential that everyone needed every single day. On the other hand, they were often viewed with suspicion, seen as potential cheats who might water down their flour, use inferior grains, or employ other tricks to increase their profits at the expense of their customers' stomachs. This suspicion wasn't entirely unfounded. The temptation to cut corners was enormous, especially during times when grain was expensive or scarce. A baker might be tempted to add sawdust to extend his flour, or to use grain that was beginning to spoil, or to make his loaves slightly smaller while charging the same price. The guild regulations and municipal inspections existed precisely because these practices were common enough to be a real problem. But for the honest baker, the one who took pride in his craft and wanted to build a lasting business, the morning routine we've been following was just the beginning of a day that would stretch well into the evening. After the morning's bread was sold, there would be preparation for the next day's batch. The sourdough starter had to be fed and maintained. New supplies had to be purchased, which meant negotiating with grain merchants, millers, and salt dealers, who all had their own ideas about fair prices. The grain itself was a constant source of worry. Medieval wheat was nothing like the standardized, consistent product we know today. Each batch might have different moisture content, different protein levels, different baking characteristics. A baker had to adjust his techniques constantly, adding more water here, kneading longer there, changing his timing based on subtle differences in how the grain behaved. Storage was another challenge. Grain had to be kept dry, which was difficult in buildings that were poorly heated and often damp. Rodents were a constant threat, capable of contaminating or destroying entire supplies overnight. Insects could infest stored grain, and there were no effective pesticides beyond keeping cats around and hoping for the best. The miller relationship was particularly complex. Most bakers didn't own their own mills, which meant they were dependent on the local miller to grind their grain into flour. This relationship was fraught with potential problems. Millers could cheat by keeping some of the grain for themselves, or by adulterating the flour with cheaper substances. They could also delay grinding, which could throw off a baker's entire schedule. Some bakers tried to maintain good relationships with multiple millers, spreading their business around to avoid being too dependent on any one person. Others would make the long journey to distant mills if they heard about better quality or fairer dealing. But transportation was slow and expensive, and grain was heavy, so these options weren't always practical. The seasonal variations in grain quality meant that a baker's techniques the year. Spring grain might have to evolve throughout, be damp from winter storage, and require longer drying times. Summer grain might be so dry that it needed extra water in the dough. Fall grain, freshly harvested, might have different fermentation characteristics than grain that had been stored for months. Weather affected everything. Humid days meant dough that rose differently and took longer to bake properly. Cold days meant ovens that were harder to heat and maintain. Rainy days meant customers who were reluctant to venture out, leading to unsold bread and financial losses. A skilled baker learned to read the sky almost as carefully as he read his dough, adjusting his plans based on what the weather might bring. The physical toll of the work was enormous. By the time our baker reached his 30s, his back would be permanently bent from leaning over kneading troughs. His hands would be scarred from handling hot tools and burned from accidental contact with oven walls. His lungs would be coated with flour dust that never quite cleared, leading to a chronic cough that marked veteran bakers as clearly as their white dusted clothes. Sleep was always insufficient. Even when the day's work was technically done, there was preparation for tomorrow. The starter had to be checked one more time. The fire had to be banked properly so it wouldn't die completely overnight. The shop had to be secured against thieves, who knew that bread and flour were valuable commodities worth stealing. The apprentice system provided some relief, but it also created new responsibilities. Young boys, sometimes as young as 10 or 12, would be brought into the bakery to learn the trade, but they needed constant supervision, especially around the dangerous ovens and sharp tools. A clumsy apprentice could ruin a day's work in seconds, and the master baker was responsible for both the boy's safety and his education. Teaching the subtleties of bread making to someone who could barely read was a challenge that required infinite patience. How do you explain the feel of properly kneaded dough to someone who has never experienced it? How do you describe the sound of bread that's ready to come out of the oven? These skills could only be learned through repetition, trial and error, and countless small failures that gradually built up into expertise. The apprentices also had to learn the business side of baking. They needed to understand how to calculate costs, how to negotiate with suppliers, how to deal with difficult customers. They had to memorize the complex guild regulations and municipal laws that governed every aspect of bread production and sale. A master baker who failed to properly educate his apprentices would find his reputation suffering when those boys eventually set up their own shops. Competition between bakers was fierce, but also strangely collaborative. In times of crisis, when grain was scarce or when fires destroyed ovens, bakers would often help each other out. But on ordinary days, they competed ruthlessly for customers, each trying to produce bread that was just a little bit better, a little bit cheaper, or a little bit more appealing than their rivals. The guild system was supposed to prevent this competition from becoming destructive, but it often had the opposite effect. Guild meetings were opportunities for bakers to spy on each other's techniques, to spread rumors about competitors' quality, and to form alliances that could drive smaller operators out of business. Politics within the guild were often as complex and vicious as politics in the royal court. Innovation was discouraged by both tradition and regulation. A baker who tried to introduce new techniques or ingredients might find himself accused of adulterating his product or violating guild standards. Change came slowly and only after long periods of quiet experimentation and gradual acceptance. Yet despite all these challenges, the successful medieval baker occupied a respected position in his community. His product was literally the staff of life, and his skills were recognized as essential to civilization itself. A town without a baker was a town in trouble, and everyone knew it. The early morning hours, the physical labor, the constant worry about quality and regulations, all of this was the price of practicing a trade that would never disappear as long as people needed to eat. The baker's day that began in darkness would end in darkness as well, but it was a different kind of darkness. The morning darkness was full of potential, of unbaked loaves and unlit ovens. The evening darkness was full of accomplishment, of bread sold and customers satisfied, of another day's work completed in the endless cycle that connected grain to table, farmer to family, and tradition to survival. As our baker finally closed his shop for the evening, his work was far from over. The dying embers in his oven still held precious heat that couldn't be wasted. This residual warmth would serve the community in ways that extended far beyond bread making. Housewives would arrive with their Sunday roasts, carefully prepared pies, and slow-cooking stews, all designed to take advantage of the baker's oven during its long, gradual cool-down period. This secondary use of the oven was both a service and a necessity. Most medieval homes had only simple hearths that were adequate for boiling, frying, and basic cooking, but completely inadequate for the kind of sustained, even heat needed for roasting or baking. The baker's oven, with its thick stone walls still radiating warmth, hours after the bread was removed, provided the perfect solution. The timing had to be precise. Immediately after the bread came out, when the oven was still blazingly hot, it might be used for quick cooking items or for browning the tops of dishes that needed intense heat. As the temperature gradually dropped, it became perfect for slow roasts that needed hours of gentle, consistent warmth. By late evening, when the oven was barely warm, it might be used for drying herbs, warming invalids' broths, or keeping prepared foods at serving temperature. So there you have it, the hidden world of medieval bakers who shaped their communities one loaf at a time, working through the coldest hours when the rest of the world slept peacefully. From the sacred sourdough starter to the final cooling rack, every step was a dance between tradition and survival, between craft and commerce. These flour-dusted artisans didn't just make bread, they made civilization possible, rising before dawn so that others could rise with the sun. Sweet dreams, and may your own mornings feel a little less demanding after glimpsing theirs.